Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's Yoma class.
So this is our fifth of 5 classes on Masechet Yoma. And as I said from the beginning, because of the way this was set up with 5, 20-minute shiurim, this was not intended to be comprehensive or even specifically consequential, but to give you a window into the earliest rabbinic material on the holiday that's coming up. And we spent about 3.5 of the weeks focusing on early Mishnayot from the first chapter that dealt with the Kohen Gadol and dealt with some of the culture of the Kohen Gadol and the culture of that office. And then we skipped to the beginning of the 8th chapter, which is the last chapter of Masechet Yoma, to deal with basics, but to go deeper into the basics. So we're going to be ending with that today, and it might demystify for you, if you haven't studied this material before, not only which are the things that are prohibited on Yom Kippur, but what is the distinction between them halachically and why they are specifically prohibited. Okay, so we looked at the Mishnah last week, but I want to read it through quickly because we're going to be discussing it. So I want you to have the text fresh in your mind. Yom Kippurim asur ba'achila b'shtiyah. On Yom Kippur, you're prohibited from eating and drinking. That's considered one thing. It's 2 words, but it's one of the 5 things. Uverechitza, and washing yourself, right, according to halacha, except for basic sanitary washing. We do not bathe on Yom Kippur. Uvesicha, anointing, understood usually to be anointing with oil. There's actually a question in the later halachic sources whether or not you're supposed to be putting on deodorant on Yom Kippur, or if that's considered our version of anointing with oil. Uven ilata sandal, wearing sandals, or some understood to be wearing leather shoes. Uven tashmish hamita, marital intimacy. But the king and the bride are allowed to wash their faces. V'hachaya tinolata sandal. And the birthing mother, or as we said last week, some people read this for some reason to be the midwife, can wear such comfortable sandals. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer, that's according to Rabbi Eliezer, b'chachamim osrin. The sages are more stringent, Rabbi Eliezer is more lenient. The question is the machloket between them on all of the leniencies or just the last one? And Bartanura, the Italian sage, if you look at the last thing that he wrote on this Mishnah that we read last week, Divrei Rabbi Eliezer, Akul Hukai. All these words of Rabbi Eliezer are on all of these leniencies. Amelach v'chala v'chaya, meaning there's a disagreement between Rabbi Eliezer and the sages in all of them. V'halacha Rabbi Eliezer. The law goes to Rabbi Eliezer, which means that we rule halachically leniently in those 3 cases. Okay, that's where we picked off last week. Now I want to look at some other commentaries that help break down this it's an informative Mishnah, but like classical Mishnaic text, it's very terse, right? The Mishnah, one of the reasons why the Talmud has the Gemara is that there were hundreds of years of conversations on each Mishnah, because the Mishnah is written in extremely restrained language without giving all of the extra information or even the background information. Okay. So this is the Rambam. The Maimonides, the Rambam, wrote a commentary on the Mishnah. In some ways, people consider this to be his most impressive work, even though it's not his most famous work, right? His 2 most famous works are his Mishnah Torah, his Code of Jewish Law, also called the Yad HaChazakah, the strong hand. It's called Yad HaChazakah because Yad, the gematria of Yad is 14, Yud Daled, and there were 14 sections of his book. And the other book that is most famous for is the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, his philosophical treatise. What's particularly impressive about his commentary on the Mishnah is it's a commentary on the Mishnah refracted through the entire Talmudic canon. I think he wrote it at age 21 or something. So what's impressive about it is how comprehensive and voluminous his knowledge was as such a young man. Okay, so he's going to explain how these things got to be what's prohibited in the Torah, because I'm sure you know your Parshat Emor and your Parshat Pinchas pretty well, where Yom Kippur is mentioned. There's no sandal mentioned, there's no oil mentioned, there's even no eating or drinking mentioned. In fact, there's really just one word that's mentioned, and that's what we're going to go into. Lo be'era Torah miniyah me'elu hadvarim b'yom tzom Kippur. The Rambam says it straight out. The Torah never prohibited these things. So here's the Mishnah with the authority of the rabbi saying, you can't do these 5 things on Yom Kippur, and you, the reader, the Rambam is saying, probably already know the Torah never says so, right? It's a version of, whether or not you can use two separate dishwashers for kashrut. The Torah did not mention dishwashers, right? And the Torah did not mention engines in a car. The Torah mentioned don't do labor, and lo tevaruesh b'chol moshvotechem, do not ignite any flame. So a lot of our halachic material is a mountain hanging on a thread, right? And the thread here is very, very thin because the Torah does not mention anything about these 5 things. Aval amar hakatuv lishon inui chamesh pamim. But if you count up the 5 different places where the basic obligation of Yom Kippur, which is ta'anu et nafshotechem, although that is said in several different ways, to afflict yourselves, it is written 5 times. Some of you know a little bit about the laws of kashrut, know that how many times something is mentioned also impacts what things are prohibited in kashrut. So, lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, you may not boil a kid in its mother's milk, is mentioned 3 times in the Torah. Those exact words. The rabbis in the Midrash understood that to mean that there are 3 prohibitions regarding milk and meat. You can't cook them together, even if they're not related to each other. You cannot eat them if someone else cooked them, nor may you derive any benefit from them. Meaning, if you happen to own a cheeseburger, according to halacha, someone gives it to you, you can't sell it and make a profit on it. You can't even derive any benefit from the mixture of milk and meat, which, by the way, is not the case for just trafe animals. If I own a pig farm, I'm allowed to derive benefit from it. I can't derive benefit from a cheeseburger farm, but I'm bummed. So the Torah says here, the Rambam says here, that there are 5 places where inui, this affliction, is mentioned. I'm not going to go through each of them in their own site, but you can see them. It says in the 23rd chapter of Vayikra, Shabbat Shabbaton, the Sabbath. That phrase, Shabbat Shabbaton, appears also in the 16th chapter of Vayikra. In Bamidbar, chapter 29, this is Parshat Pinchas, Uv Asor Lachodesh. Later on in that verse, it says the word Ta'anu. In Vayikra 23, this is Parshat Emor, and also Vayikra 16, Vaytazot Lachem, this is Parshat Acharei Mot. So there are 5 places where Yom Kippur is referenced, and even though the Rambam in his commentary doesn't include the part of the verse that has the word inui, that's what he's saying. Okay. Uva'ah ha-Kabbalah. This is really interesting language. Kabbalah means the received tradition. It's this amorphous reference to rabbinic received tradition, sometimes represented in the Mishnah itself, sometimes represented just in the chain of transmission of rabbinic law. But it came down through received tradition. Kiva'u le'asor chamisha darim mehana haraguf. The rabbis understood that these 5 mentionings of inui were coming to prohibit 5 things related to bodily pleasure, right? Just kind of pause your thinking for a second. In some ways, what we do living rabbinic Jewish lives is very chutzpahdik if we believe that the Torah came from God word for word at Sinai. Heschel goes into this a little bit in his masterful book, Torah min Hashemayim, Heavenly Torah, where he basically discusses the different midrashic approaches to from Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. On some level, you can imagine midrashic expansion of the Torah's text to be a love gesture. I love this material so much, I want to squeeze every possible meaning out of it. I don't want to just not do the things that I maybe don't have to do. That I certainly don't have to do. I want to not do the things that I maybe don't have to do. On some level, you can read expansive midrashic treatment of the Torah text as being disrespectful to the Torah. The Torah didn't tell you to do this, right? So this whole notion of a received Kabbalah is how our spiritual ancestors treated the Torah, and it's still an ongoing question as to whether or not we're right, or the Karaites are right? What are the Karaites not doing Yom Kippur? They don't afflict themselves. They're not, because that's all the Torah says to do. The rabbinic received tradition says that they came to prohibit these 5 things that relate to bodily pleasure. What are they? Haim, achila v'shtiyah, eating and drinking, rechitza b'mayim, washing yourself in water, sicha b'shemen, anointing yourself in oil, ni'ilat sandal, wearing some kind of a comfortable sandal or shoe, v'tashmish hamita, marital intimacy. Uva b'chol achat me'elu hamilot b'sfarim milat inui. The Rambam makes reference to something but doesn't make it explicit. We're going to read it explicitly in a following commentary, that each of these 5 things, somewhere in biblical texts, there is an attachment with the word inui, affliction, and eating and drinking. There's an attachment from the word inui to anointing. And we're going to have to go searching through the text to find them. The Rambam does not include them here. Lefi shehem rimazim va'asmachtot. They're all hinted at. Asmachtot are like, it's from the root smicha, to like, to cover something or to be hooked onto something. These are just kind of little hints that the Bible left us for us to uncover, suggesting that because the Torah used the word inui 5 times regarding Yom Kippur, there are 5 thingies that are related to it, and if you look hard enough, you can find them. The ikar isuram Kabbalah, but the primary way in which these things are prohibited are Kabbalah. What he means by that is, the Rambam, really want you to know that the Torah doesn't really prohibit you from doing it. Rabbinic received tradition, I'm going to be somewhat punchy, guesswork prohibits you from doing it. But the Torah doesn't. The primary prohibition is one of rabbinic received tradition, which means it's a lower category of prohibition. Which means if you do any of these things, you're quote-unquote only liable for lashes of rebelliousness. That's the punishment you would get if you violated a rabbinic prohibition as opposed to a Torah-based prohibition, right? It's not particularly pleasant, but it's far better than the prohibition for violating certain Torah-based prohibitions. The zehu inyan omram asur. That's what we mean when we use the word asur. They are prohibited, but they're lowercase p prohibited, not capital P prohibited. Milvad achila v'shtia, except for eating and drinking. Shehu chayav karet. If you eat or drink on Yom Kippur, that's considered the primary self-affliction. And if you eat one of those, you're chayav karet, you're obligated for the punishment of karet. We could spend a whole semester on what being chayav karet means, but basically it was the rabbi's understanding that it meant that you were cut off from the people of Israel. Your soul was cut off for now and forevermore. It was considered even a worse punishment than, wait for it, mitat beit din, the court executing you. Because if the court executed you, like for violating Shabbat in public, at least your soul had a connection to the Jewish people Olam Haba. If you were chayiv karet, it was God essentially executing you, and you never had a connection to the Jewish people in the world to come. If you eat the right amount, a kazayat, of intentionally of water or food, then, or actually it's a different amount. It's a kazayat is a solid measurement, the liquid measurement is different, then you're obligated for karet. Okay, that's the Rambam. Now we look at Ikar Tosfot Yom Tov. We looked at him last week also. This is Rabbi Yom Tov Lippman Heller, who lived in Krakow in the 16th century, I edited this a little bit because I knew we wouldn't have a lot of time. He shares with us some of the ways you can connect. Remember that wild goose chase that Rambam referenced, Inui? How do we connect Inui, affliction, with these 5 things? The Ikar Tosfot Yom Tov gives us the compass points to them. But achila v'shtia, when it comes to eating and drinking, achila v'shtila da'akru inui minalan. Where in our tradition do we have a reference to eating and drinking in connecting it to the concept of inui? Ketiv hacha, it says here, Vayikra 16, that verse from Acharei Mot, ta'anu, uchtiv vaya'ancha vayarivecha. Okay, what is that context? 1 second, where am I? Okay, so this is Parshat Akev, and verse 3. Well, let's go back to verse 2. V'zacharta kol haderech, this is God anticipating what the Israelites' experience is going to be when they get to the land of Canaan. You're going to remember that whole pathway. Asher holichecha Adonai Elohecha, that I, your God, or maybe Moshe it's in Moshe's voice, brought you forward. Ze arba'im shana, for 40 years. Bamidbar, in the desert. Laman anotcha lenasotecha, in order to afflict you a little bit, l'nasatecha, and to test you, la'adat asher bilavcha hatishmor mitzvotav imlo, to see whether or not you really had it inside of you to follow God's commands. Vaya'ancha vayarivecha. God afflicted you, and he made you hungry. Vaya'echilcha taman. So in that verse, we're connecting inui, affliction, and ra'av, reish, ayin, bet, hunger. God created a hunger for you in the desert so that God could provide for you the man. We have a connection between affliction and not eating, and or needing to eat. And therefore, according to the Tosfot Yontav, where's my core text? That is the proof text that suggests that eating and drinking is the first primary way in which you afflict yourself in Yom Kippur. Down to this line, Shma Mina, learn from that, Deravon Ikre Inui, that hunger is a sort of affliction. Sicha, I skipped a few. Where do we know that anointing is affliction? I wanted to include this one because it's very infrequent that we go to the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel for a halachic source. Book of Daniel may be the least, studied book in the Torah, particularly in the original, because it's in very, very hard ancient Aramaic. Aramaic much more hard to understand than Talmudic Aramaic. So let's look at the book of Daniel, chapter 10, verses 3 and 12. Okay. So Daniel is in the king's court, and look at him reminiscing. Verse 3: Lechem chamudot lo achalti. I didn't eat any pleasant bread during this time. Ubasar v'yayin lo ba'alpi, and flesh and wine did not come onto my mouth. By the way, some of Daniel is written in Hebrew, but a lot of it is also written in Aramaic. V'soch lo sachti, and I didn't anoint. Ad malot shloshet shavuim yamim, until those whole 3 weeks were finished. That's verse 3. If you go down to verse 12, Vayomer Eli, and then he said to me, Al tira Daniel, do not be afraid. Ki min hayom harishon asher natata et libcha, from the very first day that you gave your heart to me. Lahavin, to understand. Ulehit anot. It's translated here as to humble oneself. But what is the root of lehit anot? Inui, afflict. So in the 10th chapter of Daniel, his self-memory of not eating and not drinking wine and not anointing oneself is described later on as a version of self-affliction. Therefore, as the Tosfot Yontav says, dichtiv lechem, etc., v'such lo sachti, and it says later on, ki min hayom lehit anot. That not anointing yourself is considered a self-affliction. The last one, Tosfot Yontav, that Rashi Teva, that acronym, 3 lines from the bottom where my cursor is, Tashmish Hamita. It's that wonderful euphemism, using the bed, right? Marital intimacy. How do we know that marital intimacy is considered an affliction? A really interesting source. It's a story you might know, but you never thought of it this way. Chapter 31 of Breshit, verse 50. This is the very end of the encounter between Yaakov and Lavan, the end of Parshat Vayetze, and they make a pact that allows Yaakov to go back to the land of Canaan with Rachel and Leah. And look at what Lavan says, and notice what's interesting here. We're learning halachic language about a prohibition on our most solemn day from something that a non-Jew, Lavan, says to Yaakov. Right? This is why it's an asmachta, Rambam's language. The Torah doesn't really say this. It's a hint. It's a maybe. From Laban, we're going to learn that we can't have sex on Yom Kippur. Yeah. Im ta'aneh et bnotai. If you afflict my daughter, that's that verb inui. Im tikach nashim al bnotai. And you take other wives on my daughters. What does it mean to take another wife on my daughters? Meaning if you marry again and bring more women into your bed, if you're using your bed with other women, that's considered a violation of what you and I have discussed. And therefore, we can understand that being intimate with a woman is considered in the category of inui. But notice how it's a jump on a jump. The affliction here is to Laban or to his daughters. Not that the act of sexual intercourse is of itself an affliction to the people doing it. It's an affliction vis-a-vis the promise that Yaakov is making. And still, it's close enough. We've got sex, we've got inui in the same category, and I'm saying this smilingly, that is enough in this chain of Kabbalah to prohibit all of you married folks out there to be intimate with your spouses on Yom Kippur, right? And it's a very serious, there's no serious halachic Jew who wouldn't consider that to be prohibited on Yom Kippur, right? The source of it is extremely obscure and disconnected from Pshat. Okay, that's Ikar Tosi Yom Tov. We're almost done. I know we're almost at 8:30. I want to read one more with you. Yachin, Rabbi Yisrael Lipschitz, who was the rabbi in Av Beit Din in Danzig, amongst many places, and he writes a wonderful commentary in the Mishnah called Yachin Uboaz, representing two pillars in Solomon's temple. One focuses on Pshat and one focuses on a deeper meaning. So this is from Yachin. So this is his simpler commentary on this Mishnah of Yoma. On the word Hachaya, that birthing mother who's allowed to wear sandals. Kol shloshim yom achar leida. She's allowed to wear them all 30 days after she's given birth. V'hu adin, same is true. Kol chole, anyone who's sick. Afilu she'enu mesukan mutar. Even if you're not sick dangerously, you're allowed. You might have heard at some point, in your life, that if somebody, if there's a concern about whether or not you violate one of these rules, you listen to the doctor before you listen to the rabbi, or the rabbi yields to the doctor. If you're feeling that prohibiting yourself from these comforts is going to make you a little bit sick, or because you're sick, it's going to be even more oppressive for you, even a little bit, even if it's not dangerously sick such that you're close to dying, we are lenient. I saw that your hand is up, Stevie. Hold on one second. Vehekilu be'elu, and they were lenient with these, mishum derak achila ushtiya hein midoraita, because going back to what the Rambam said, we might have asmachtot and remazim, little hints and hooks for the other ones, but it's really just eating and drinking that is considered prohibited directly from the Torah. Although I'm going to add in, even there, it seems like an asmachta. The Torah does not say you may not eat or drink. We just understand that the primary thing that we're learning out of all of these connections between Inui and the prohibitions are eating and drinking. Ubahanach lo gazru. And on the other ones, the ones that were not from the Midoraita, they're not from the Torah, the rabbis did not decree, meaning they did not decree that you had to be extra special careful about it. That's according to the Rosh, a medieval halachist. Ularan, according to Ran, Rabbeinu Nisim of Geronda, Kulan Asurim Midoraita. He takes a more stringent approach. All of these five, against the Rambam, against Maimonides, are prohibited directly from the Torah, right? And to understand why someone would say that, it's not that he doesn't know the Torah and that he thinks that the things are mentioned explicitly in the Torah. There are plenty of things that are considered asur midoraita, prohibited with Torah authority, even though they're not mentioned explicitly in the Torah, because some rabbinic midrash was understood to be actually uncovering what the Torah intended, which is different than back connecting prohibitions to what the Torah might have been talking about. So Rabbeinu Nisim says, no, those five things, they really were intended by biblical sources, and therefore they are prohibited on that level. Rak dahanach de'enan mefurashim b'Torah. But since they are not mentioned explicitly, their authority is from the Torah, but since they're not mentioned explicitly, masran hakatuv l'chachamim l'hakel behen ve'et hatzorach. The tradition passed it down to the sages that it's okay to be lenient upon them when the time is, when you need to. This is the last text I wanted to teach you. I want to see if you have any questions. And what I wanted you to pull out from this is, first of all, if you look at with even a bit of a microscope at any subcategory of Jewish law, of halakha, you're going to find this kind of a treasure map, right? That the number of pages on my shelf in my office that are dedicated to halachic practice are hundreds of times longer than the number of pages I have of Torah and Bible text directly, right? We live a rabbinic tradition that some people think of it like entropy, where everything is always kind of growing in a system. It's very hard to contract rabbinic law. It's constantly growing. And even when it comes to the basic things that you have known from childhood that one ought not do on Yom Kippur, these are linkages that the rabbis found by looking for connections with one and two words here and there, and then have endured over thousands of years as the way we observe Yom Kippur even to this day. So let me see. There were who had a question? Stevie, you had a question. You still there, Stevie? I'm unmuting you. Oh, you unmuted yourself and then I muted you. Sorry. You got to unmute again. There you go.
Okay. Just on the sex one, it doesn't seem to me like that far of a stretch that if Yaakov had taken another wife, then he would presumably be spending some nights not with his previous wives. And so if he's not having sex with, Rachel or Leah, then he's afflicting them. And therefore affliction and lack of sex seem to be related. It doesn't seem like a big stretch, but it's not a critical point.
No, that's a good point. That's a nice read. You're saying that the halachic read of what Laban is saying is that if you afflict my wives by withholding sex from them, as opposed to if you afflict my wives by having sex with someone else, is that how you're reading it?
Yeah.
That actually might be what was intended. Good. That's I accept that gloss, right? That the affliction is holding back intimacy from them. Therefore, miniyah, preventing yourself from intimacy is considered an affliction, and therefore it's one of the things we do on Yom Kippur. Great, I accept that. This is not ending with a crescendo, right? Because we didn't study all 8 chapters of Yom Kippur, but I wanted to give you a window into some of the things that were present when the temple stood, and the high priests were the ones who were actually living out the Yom Kippur rules. And I wanted to give you some background into why the 5 things that I would imagine all of you are going to be holding back from about 20 days from now, what might be some of the reasons that you'd be doing it, and how we got to that particular list of prohibitions.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.